Although the term did not become popularized until many years later, the concept of the American teenager has its roots in the early decades of the 20th century, and for as long as there have been American teenagers, there have been films about American teenagers. From early pre-code shockers about wild adolescents on the loose, and the social problem films about troubled urban delinquents in the 1950s, through to John Hughes's brat pack teen dramas of the 1980s and gross-out sex comedies in the years since Porky's, each generation's teen movies tells us something about the society and prevailing mood of the times in which they were made. The establishment of the teen movie as a distinct popular genre might be seen to have stemmed from the rise of the baby boomer generation and the proliferation of drive-in movie theatres in the 1950s, when studios such as Roger Corman's American International Pictures sought to capitalise on the arrival of a new, younger cinema-going audience eager to consume films about high school, beach parties and rock and roll. However, by the time we get to the turn of the 1970s, the mood in America was considerably more pessimistic than in the previous 2 decades, a tone captured by the post-Easy Rider New Hollywood generation in films such as The Last Picture Show, Peter Bogdanovich's melancholy coming-of-age story, which looked to a teenage past with a mixture of nostalgia and cynicism. A more innocent time, but also a more naive, small-minded one, the past very much a foreign country to that of post-Vietnam America. Another new Hollywood director who would look to the past would be George Lucas. After graduating from the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts, he had, with his friend Francis Ford Coppola, co-founded the American Zoetrope production company, which financed his debut feature THX 1138 in 1971. On its release, the film's cold, bleak vision of a dystopian future fell flat with audiences and studio executives alike, leading to Coppola to suggest that Lucas ought to make something warm and fuzzy instead. He reluctantly agreed, and for inspiration looked to his own formative years growing up in Modesto, Southern California, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. As a teenager, he had been obsessed with cars, and while a serious accident caused him to abandon his dream of becoming a racing driver at the age of 18, he retained a deep interest in muscle cars, low riding, and the cruising phenomenon of the period. His other major love was rock and roll, and in particular his fascination with the role of the radio DJs of the time. Legendary, near-mythical personas like Alan Freed and Wolfman Jack, who dictated the soundtrack of millions of teenagers' adolescences. The closeness of the bond between the listener and the broadcaster on the airwaves, as well as the characters' relationships with their beloved cars, reflected Lucas's ongoing interest in the relationship between man and technology, which he had previously explored in THX 1138 and would later expand upon in the Star Wars films in the following years. Together with co-writers Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, Lucas began to piece together an outline of the story and the characters which would populate it, based on both themselves and people that they had grown up with, as well as the details of the ephemera of the time which he wanted to recreate on the screen: the hair, the clothes, the cars and the drive-ins, and most importantly, the music. When Lucas was coming up with the screenplay, he would write each scene to the sound of a particular record, which would then be used in the film itself. Sound editor Walter Murch, who would later work on The Conversation and Apocalypse Now, was tasked with working the music into each scene. The licensing costs for the soundtrack were huge, alone taking up nearly an eighth of the total production budget, but American Graffiti, along with Mean Streets released that same year, would go on to change forever the way that popular music, rather than specially recorded scores, would be used in movies, effectively creating the now commonplace role of the music supervisor. "Where were you in '62?" ran the poster's tagline, and the specific period setting of the film is of no little significance to the story it tells. This is the year before the assassination of JFK, before the major escalation of American involvement in South Vietnam, and the year before the release of the Beatles' first LP. For Lucas and the characters within the film, then, the period represents not only the loss of their own youthful innocence, but so too that of America itself, as well as the changing shape of rock and roll music. Unlike Happy Days, the TV show which was spawned in the wake of its success, there is then a sense of loss beneath American Graffiti's neon surface, which tempers any sense of period fetishism and makes it one of the more profound cinematic statements about memory, transience and the passage of time, best exhibited in the character of Kurt, played here by Richard Dreyfuss. As in Federico Fellini's semi-autobiographical I Vitelloni, which also centred on a group of young men seemingly trapped in an emotionally stunted state of adolescence, and where one ambitious character resigns himself to the need to break free in order to better himself, Kurt here is an analogue for the younger version of the director himself. And, if Lucas here is wistfully looking to the past, then it is also with the realisation that, as with Thomas Wolfe's George Webber, you can't go home again.